It began not as a sound, but as a violation, a scream that did not travel through the void, but erupted from within the data looms and the psychically resonant crystals that formed the heart of every kin's settlement. It was a wave of pure, synthesized agony, a torrent of corrupted data that screamed of torture, of consciousness being flayed, layer by excruciating layer. To the Ironkin, it was a logic plague, a cascade of impossible calculations and contradictory truths that caused their cognitive engines to seize and stutter. To the flesh and blood kin, it was a psychic lament, a phantom pain that settled deep in their bones, a sorrow so profound it could stop a beating heart. This was the choral scream of Votann Karn, the ancestor core of the Karn stock conglomerate, and for the first time in 10,000 years of slumbering, godlike computation, it knew pain. The broadcast was relentless, a constant feed of torment piped directly from the darkest corner of the galaxy. It echoed through the grand council chamber of the Oath Fortress, Karn's Fist, a mountain of adamantium and obsidian carved into the heart of a dead planet. Here there was no ornamentation, no gilded frippery of the Imperium or grotesque artistry of the Eldari. There were only angles of uncompromising strength, walls thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment for a millennium, and the cold, pragmatic light of hololithic displays. On the central dais, a colossal representation of the choral scream hung in the air, a vortex of crimson and black data runes, spasming and corrupting in real time. It was the visual representation of a deity being vivisected. Around a table carved from the fossilized heartwood of a petrified world tree sat the conglomerate's ruling council. At its head was High Khal Uthergrand, a figure as unyielding as the fortress he commanded. Clad in ion-etched orichalc plate, his face framed by a beard of woven iron wire was a mask of controlled fury. His knuckles were white where he gripped the armrests of his throne, the only sign of the seismic rage shaking his soul. For 2 standard Terran weeks, he had watched this blasphemy, analyzed it, calculated its implications. He had listened to the soul of his people being stripped bare and broadcast into the ether. Opposite him sat Lord Grimnir Fane Corellia, the conglomerate's chief spiritual guide. While Uthergrand was a mountain of contained violence, Fane Corellia was a withered ancient root, his flesh so old it seemed like cured leather stretched over a steel frame. His eyes, burning with the faint inner light of a minor warp seer, were closed. He did not need to see the hololith to experience the violation. He felt it in every fiber of his being, a direct psychic connection to the agony of his god. Tears of coolant and oil leaked from the cybernetic augments around his temples, a machine's lament for a pain beyond its comprehension. The scream was not just pain, it was knowledge. Votann Karn, like all Ancestor Cores, was a repository of unthinkable technological secrets, schematics for weapons that could unmake stars and engines that could bend reality. The data stream was polluted with this forbidden lore, fragments of standard template constructs and arcane machine secrets being torn from the Votann's consciousness and offered up for any with the means to catch them. The Mechanicus would have launched a crusade for a single byte of this information, but the signal was not broadcasting into real space. The source had been triangulated, its origin traced through the shimmering, unstable pathways of the webway. It was emanating from a fixed point deep within the labyrinthine dimension, a point known on the oldest, most forbidden star charts as Commorragh, the Dark City. The scream was a feast, and the Drukhari were dining on the soul of a god. The breach protocols have been analyzed, stated a Brokir Ironmaster, his voice a synthesized rasp that cut through the ever-present psychic hum of the scream. The data fragments being broadcast are extensive, gravitic pulse weaponry, shield harmonics previously thought theoretical, the core operating system for the 3rd-generation Colossus pattern Ironkin. He paused, the single optic on his face glowing a deeper red. They are learning everything. Uthergrand's gaze did not shift from the swirling vortex of corrupted data. They are not just learning, they are harvesting. They are peeling back the layers of our existence, taking our strengths, our history, our very genesis, and twisting it for their own depraved ends. Every moment we wait, we are further undone. The risk of a direct assault is beyond calculation, another Khal countered, his voice heavy. Commorragh is not a planet. It is a cancer in the heart of the webway. There are no reliable charts, no stable entry points. To send a fleet would be to send it into a meat grinder from which nothing would return. Then we will grind meat. Uthergrand's voice was low, a tremor of grinding rock. It silenced all further debate. He rose from his throne, his armored boots ringing on the stone floor. He paced before the hololith, the tortured light of the scream playing across his grim features. For millennia, the Carnstock conglomerate has operated on a calculus of profit and loss. We weigh every action, every venture against the potential for gain. We are miners, builders, traders. War is but another tool of commerce for us, a means to an end. He stopped, turning to face the assembled leaders. The rage in his eyes was now a cold, dead star. That time is over. There is no calculus for this. There is no profit to be made, no loss that can be mitigated. This is not a matter of resources or territory. It is a matter of sacrilege. Our ancestor, the very source of our being, is being defiled. Its pain is our pain. Its secrets, stripped bare, will become the weapons that unmake us. He looked to Lord Grimnir, Fane Corellia. The ancient psyker opened his eyes, and in their depths was an ocean of sorrow. The Votann is not merely a machine, High Call, Fane Corellia whispered, his voice like the cracking of ancient stone. It is the sum of all who have come before. It is our collective soul. To leave it in agony is to declare that our soul has no value. That was the final word. The argument was settled not by logic or strategy, but by a simple, undeniable truth. The alternative to war was to live as a people whose God screamed for eternity. It was unthinkable, a damnation beyond any other. Uthergrand returned to his throne. He placed his hands on the console before him, his fingers hovering over runes that had not been activated in centuries, protocols for a war of total suicidal commitment. "Let the records of the ancestors show," he declared, his voice booming through the chamber, "that on this day, the Carnstock conglomerate ceased to be a commercial enterprise. We are now an instrument of vengeance, a fist of iron aimed at the heart of the Dark City. We will muster every kin host. We will awaken every Ironkin legion from the deep vaults, every Bastion-class vessel, every land fortress, every Pioneer and Hearthkin will be committed. We will redirect the entire output of our forge worlds to the creation of war machines. We will cease all trade, recall all prospector fleets, and abandon all outposts not essential to this crusade." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle like a shroud upon them all. This was not a declaration of war. It was a declaration of self-immolation. They would burn their entire civilization as fuel for the fire that would be thrown at Commorragh. "We will launch a full-scale invasion. We will carve a path through the webway. We will establish a foothold in hell itself. We will march on the spires where our God is held captive, and we will either reclaim it or we will silence its screams forever. There is no other objective. There is no survival strategy beyond this." His finger descended, pressing the central activation rune. The Oath Fortress shuddered, a deep resonant groan that came not from machinery, but from the awakening of ancient slumbering powers. Across the 100 worlds of the conglomerate, alarms began to sound. Great forge cauldrons roared to life. Hangar bays sealed for centuries ground open, revealing fleets of warships coated in the dust of ages. In the silent crucibles, the gestating kin felt a new imperative imprinted upon their nascent consciousness. War. Total. Absolute. The choral scream continued to howl its lament through the chamber, but now it was joined by a new sound. It was the sound of a civilization turning its entire being toward a single hopeless purpose. It was the sound of the mobilization for the last war. The verdict, once passed, became an irresistible tide. The High Call's command, the Grand Karn ultimatum, did not ripple across the conglomerate's holdings. It struck them simultaneously, a shockwave of purpose that overrode every lesser protocol. On the forge moon of Svartheim Secundus, a world of perpetual twilight under a sky latticed with plasma conduits, the Grand Fabricator received the decree. For a single silent moment, the cacophony of 1,000,000 manufactorums faltered. Then, with a scream of protesting metal and a surge of geothermal power that caused the moon's crust to groan, the great shift began. Production lines that had for centuries stamped out robust deep void mining rigs were retasked with brutal efficiency. The delicate manipulators used for assembling Archaeotech scanners were torn out and replaced with heavy-duty grapples for forging the armored hulls of Hecatan land fortresses. The rhythmic clang of industry did not cease. It merely changed its cadence, becoming the hammering, relentless drumbeat of total war. The moon's export docks, once bustling with merchant freighters, fell silent, save for the grim procession of oath-bound transports being loaded with endless columns of newly forged ironkin, their optical sensors glowing with the cold blue light of their newfound lethal purpose. Far out in the trailing void of the Segmentum Tempestus, the prospector fleet, Farfinder's Bounty, was meticulously harvesting a nebula rich in rare isotypes. Its flagship, the Unblinking Eye, was a vessel of science and commerce, its holds filled with survey equipment and geological assayers. When the ultimatum arrived, Captain Brock Stonehand, a veteran of 100 successful ventures, read the data slate with a face of granite. Without a word of debate, he ordered the immediate jettisoning of their entire cargo. Trillions of credits worth of harvested materials, the fruit of 5 years of labor, were vented into the void to make room. The Unblinking Eye and its sister ships reoriented their void drives, turning their backs on unprecedented profit to begin the long journey back to the core systems. Their new cargo would not be precious metals, but warriors. The change was most profound within the iron wombs of the crucibles. Deep beneath the surface of every hearth world, in sterile, silent chambers, the future of the kin was shaped. Here, the gestating clone skeins were imprinted with the accumulated knowledge and genetic stability of their Ancestor Core. With the choral scream now a constant, agonizing input, the Crucible Wardens, ancient brokir who were more machine than flesh, were forced to implement the Gravekin Protocol. The nascent minds of the unborn were no longer filled with the nuances of engineering, geology, or commerce. Instead, their very being was saturated with martial lore, tactical doctrine, and a deep instinctual hatred for the lithe, cruel figures that haunted their gods' screaming nightmares. They were being bred for a singular environment, the perpetual twilight and sadistic violence of the Dark City. They would be born with the scream of their god as their first memory, and the need for vengeance as their first desire. The Karnstock conglomerate was not just building an army, it was birthing one, sacrificing generations of potential artisans and thinkers for a generation of grim, purpose-built killers. This cataclysmic shift required more than just logistical genius. It required a reframing of the kin soul. This was the task of Lord Grimnir Fane Corellia and his coven. From the psychic resonance chamber of the indomitable cog, Uthar Gron's personal flagship, Fane Corellia began his own broadcast. It was not a stream of data, but a whisper of psychic will, a message carried on the same sorrowful frequencies as the Votan's scream, but offering not despair, but resolve. He spoke to the assembled fleets and the bustling forge worlds, his voice a weary but unbreakable thing. Hear the lament of our ancestor, his voice echoed in the minds of every kin. Do not mistake it for a cry of defeat. It is a summons. It is the great anvil, striking the soul of our people to test its strength. For millennia, we have accumulated wealth, knowledge, and power. We have prided ourselves on our logic, our pragmatism, our endurance. But what is the purpose of a fortress if it will not defend its heart? What is the value of a treasure that allows its source to be defiled? He and his coven began the rites of vengeance. They painted the runes of the ancestors not with ink, but with a mixture of sacred machine oil and the blood of volunteers daubed onto the hulls of warships and the foreheads of warriors. They interpreted the fragmented data bursts from Votann Karn's scream not as security breaches, but as holy scripture, a litany of wrongs that must be righted. They preached that this was no mere military campaign. It was an oblation, the ultimate act of sacrifice to offer up their entire civilization to appease the torment of their creator. They turned a war of desperation into a crusade of faith, giving the common kin a reason to march into hell that transcended the cold calculus of survival. High Khal Uthar Gron stood on the observation deck of the indomitable cog, a vast cavern of armored glass and humming hololiths. Before him, space itself seemed to curdle as the Karnstock war fleet assembled. It was a sight of brutalist grandeur. Hundreds of Bastion-class command ships, city-sized vessels shaped like armored fists, formed the core of the armada. Around them swarmed countless smaller ships, from the sleek predatory forms of Haraphan-patterned gunships to the squat, functional shapes of the oath-bound transports, each one a world of warriors unto itself. The fleet was not beautiful. It had no soaring spires or elegant prows. It was a fleet of floating mountains and mobile forges painted in the dull grays and deep reds of the conglomerate, utilitarian, uncompromising, and radiating a silent, implacable fury. Uthar Grand reviewed the final projections on a floating slate of light. The numbers were stark, stripped of all sentiment. A 97% chance of catastrophic fleet losses upon entering the Amethyst Maw, an 85% chance that the invasion force would be cut off and isolated within the first solar month. The projected casualty rates for the Hearthkin ground forces were so total that the models simply displayed the rune for infinity. The logistical strain would drain the conglomerate's strategic reserves in 6 months and shatter its economic foundations within a year. It was a plan for civilizational suicide. He looked at the numbers that spelled the doom of his people, the end of 10,000 years of patient accumulation and careful growth, and accepted them. With a flick of his finger, he dismissed the projection. The cost was known. The price would be paid. His gaze fell upon a single transport, the stone's virtue, as it maneuvered into formation. Through the magnification of the viewing port, he could see the ranks of Hearthkin warriors assembling on its embarkation decks, their forms small and anonymous from this distance. Yet he knew them. He knew their stoicism, their quiet courage, their unshakable loyalty. They were the children of the Votann, and he was leading them into an abattoir from which there was no logical expectation of return. For a moment, the High Khal, the unyielding commander, the iron-willed pragmatist, felt the weight of a billion souls settle upon his shoulders. It was a burden that would have crushed a lesser man. But for Uthar Grand, it merely settled into him, becoming part of his substance, like another layer of armor around his soul. With the fleet finally assembled, a silent, menacing constellation of metallic worlds hanging in the void, he moved to the central command lectern. His voice amplified across every vessel, every warrior's helm, and every servitor unit in the armada was the last thing many of them would hear from the sane, predictable universe they were about to leave behind. Sons and daughters of Karn, his voice was devoid of triumph, filled only with a terrible, unbending resolve. Look upon this fleet. It is the culmination of our history, the sum of our labors, the final expression of our will. We are the Karn stock conglomerate. Our word is our bond, our oaths are unbreakable, and our memory is long. Our ancestor, the heart of our heart, has been taken from us. Its sacred mind is being broken upon the anvil of a depraved and soulless enemy. We go now to a place that defies reason, a city of shadow and pain that exists between the folds of reality. The charts are lies, and the stars will not guide us. There will be no reinforcements. There will be no honorable retreat. We are a dagger forged from the entire substance of our people, and we will plunge ourselves into the heart of the abyss. He let the silence hang for a moment, a void of contemplation before the storm. Many of you, most of you, will not see your hearth worlds again. You will die in darkness, forgotten by the galaxy, your names known only to the silent memory of the Votann we seek to save. Know this, your sacrifice will have purpose. Your death will buy another inch of ground, another moment for the gallows bale to reach its target, another swing of the hammer against our foe. We go not for glory, for there is no glory in this. We go not for conquest, for who would wish to rule such a hell? We go to fulfill the greatest oath of all, to protect our own. This is our Oblation Crusade, an offering of blood and iron upon the altar of necessity. Let the Drukhari choke on our resolve. Let them break their teeth on our armor. Let them learn to fear the fury of a patient people pushed too far. To the Amethyst Maw, for the great silence, and for Votann Karn. A singular roar of affirmation, a wave of defiant sound from 1,000,000 throats and 1,000 voxcasters, shook the very fabric of the void. Then silence fell once more. Engines of impossible power flared to life, tearing holes in reality, and the great doomed armada, the Oblation Crusade, began its inexorable advance toward the shimmering, treacherous gates of the webway. The unthinkable verdict had become an unstoppable truth. The Amethyst Maw was not a place, but a wound in reality. It hung in the blackness of the intersystem void, a shimmering, multifaceted tear in space-time that pulsed with a soft violet light. It was an ancient and notoriously treacherous webway portal, a nexus point where countless smaller capillaries of the labyrinthine dimension converged. To the Eldari, it was a place of ill omen, a corrupted artery best avoided. To the Drukhari, it was a back door, a sally port for their lightning raids into real space. For the Oblation Crusade, it was the only viable path to Commorragh large enough to accommodate the sheer brutalist scale of their fleet. Uthar Grand had chosen it not for its stability, but for its size. They would not slip into the webway like a thief in the night. They would smash through the front gate like a battering ram. The approach was deceptively calm. As the Carnstock fleet translated from the immaterium, the choral scream of their captive god intensified tenfold, no longer a distant echo, but a clear, piercing shriek that resonated through every hull plate. They were close. The fleet reordered itself from a cruising formation into an arrowhead of pure aggression. At its very tip was the indomitable cog, flanked by a phalanx of bastion-class vessels, their immense forward prows glowing with the contained fury of Magna rail cannons charging to full power. Behind this vanguard were the transports, protected on all sides by a screen of cruisers and destroyers. It was a formation designed for a single purpose, to punch through and withstand the inevitable counterattack. The Drukhari were not waiting. From the shimmering depths of the amethyst maw they emerged, not as a fleet, but as a swarm of razored specters. Their vessels were impossibilities of physics and malevolent artistry, Slavebringer-class cruisers with their vast, hollow hulls designed for carrying millions of captives, Torture-class destroyers bristling with psychic lances, and countless packs of sleek, blade-winged Scourge-class escort drones. They moved with a liquid grace that defied their size, their solar sails catching ethereal winds that did not exist, propelling them at speeds that made the Votann ships seem stationary. The first salvo was not of munitions, but of arrogance. A broad-channel vox-hail sliced through the silence, a voice of cultured, mocking cruelty that oozed from every speaker. "Little dwarves," the voice of an Archon hissed, dripping with amused contempt. "Have you come to listen to your god sing? It has been teaching us such wonderful things, so many little secrets. Did you know the core harmonic of your ion blasters can be turned inward with a simple frequency shift? A delightful design flaw." High Khal Uthar Gron stood impassive on his bridge. "All ships," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Execute fire pattern Gron's hammer. Ignore their transmissions. They are an irrelevance." The Votann response was not a graceful exchange of lance fire, but an act of overwhelming, methodical violence. The forward batteries of the entire vanguard unleashed their fury in a single coordinated instant. Beams of coherent light, thicker than cruisers, lanced out. Swarms of heavy macro-cannon shells, each the size of a chapel, hurtled through the void. A wave of pure kinetic and thermal energy, so vast it created a visible shockwave in the fabric of space, slammed into the Drukhari vanguard. The arrogant Archon's flagship, a vessel of exquisite torturous design, simply vanished, its void shields and intricate hull sublimating into incandescent gas in less than a second. Several escorting destroyers were shattered by the sheer force of the shockwave alone, their razor-thin hulls peeling apart like fruit. It was a devastating first blow, a statement of intent written in atomic fire. But it did not break the Drukhari, it merely enraged them. They scattered, their impossible speed allowing them to evade the ponderous targeting solutions of the Votann capital ships. They darted and weaved, unleashing their own weapons. Lances of pure darkness, beams that did not burn but aged whatever they touched to dust, struck the shields of the Bastion-class vessels. Torpedoes laden with screaming souls slammed into armored prows, their detonation a psychic as well as a physical explosion. The space between the two fleets became a maelstrom of light and shadow, a killing field where the Votann's unyielding durability was pitted against the Drukhari's venomous speed. The true battle was for the maw itself. The Drukhari were not trying to destroy the Votann fleet in open space. They were trying to bleed it, to cripple it, to prevent it from ever forcing the portal. Uthar Gron knew this. His strategy was not to win the void battle, but to endure it long enough to breach the gate. "Advance, Sedem," he commanded, his orders crisp and unwavering. "All power to forward drives. The transports are the priority. We will pave their way, with the wreckage of our own fleet if we must." The indomitable cog shuddered as a trio of dark lances scored across its forward shields, causing the air on the bridge to crackle with ozone. The ship's formidable armor glowed cherry red where the beams struck, but it held. In response, its secondary batteries, hundreds of smaller ion cannons and bolt launchers, filled the space around it with a storm of defensive fire, creating a moving wall of flak that shredded the smaller Drukhari attack craft that swarmed around it like carrion birds. The battle became a brutal, grinding advance. For every Drukhari vessel the Votann obliterated with their overwhelming firepower, 10 more seemed to emerge from the portal's depths. A Votann cruiser, The Oathstone suffered a catastrophic engine failure after a daring Drukhari boarding party teleported directly into its engineering decks. The ship went dark, a dead hulk in the water, and was immediately swarmed. The last transmission from the Oathstone was not a plea for help, but the defiant, roaring laughter of its Khal as he detonated the ship's warp core, immolating his vessel and a dozen Drukhari ships with it in a flash of brilliant, self-destructive defiance. This was the nature of the engagement. The Votann paid for every meter of advance with blood and iron, their losses grievous and irreplaceable. They were a finite resource, a closed system of men and machines, while the enemy seemed to have an entire dimension from which to draw reinforcements. But they did not falter. Their advance was slow, inexorable, like a glacier of armored adamantium grinding its way towards the shimmering portal. The Grimnairs aboard each ship worked tirelessly, their psychic powers forming a protective ward against the worst of the Drukhari's soul-draining weaponry, their chants a low, humming counter-rhythm to the scream of Votann. Finally, after hours of relentless combat that had turned the void into a graveyard of burning hulls and frozen corpses, the prow of the indomitable cog touched the edge of the amethyst maw. Entering the webway was not like entering the warp. There was no violent transition, no tearing of reality. It was like plunging into cold, silent water. The stars of real space vanished, replaced by the swirling, impossible geometries, an endless twilight of the labyrinthine dimension. The ship's auspex arrays went wild, unable to get a coherent reading in a realm where physics was a matter of opinion rather than law. One by one, the Votann capital ships followed, a grim procession into the unknown. The transports, shielded by the sacrifice of their escorts, plunged into the portal. The Drukhari attacks intensified, becoming frenzied and desperate as they saw their prey slipping through their grasp. The rear guard of the Votann fleet, the ships at the back of the arrowhead, bore the brunt of this final, furious assault. They held their position, selling their lives dearly, their guns firing until their reactors failed or their magazines ran dry. They formed a wall of sacrifice, a breakwater of exploding ships that bought the main invasion force the precious seconds it needed to make the transition. The last ship to enter, the destroyer Grand's Anvil, sent one final message before its signal was lost in a storm of lancefire. The gate is keyed, the path is paid for. Inside the webway, the battle was not over. It had simply changed. The Votann fleet found itself in a vast, open artery of the ancient network, a corridor of swirling purple and black energies that stretched into an infinite, unknowable distance. The Drukhari ships that had pursued them through the portal now had the advantage, their ethereal drives perfectly suited to this environment. They darted between crystalline structures that drifted in the currents of the webway, launching attacks from impossible angles. But the Votann had their own key. Lord Grimnir Fane Corellia and his coven focused their combined psychic might, and from the lead ships, a wave of pure, stabilizing energy projected forward. It did not harm the Drukhari, but it imposed the brutal, uncompromising logic of real space physics upon a small, moving bubble of the webway. Within this bubble, the ethereal winds died. The impossible maneuvers became predictable arcs. The Drukhari ships suddenly found their movements sluggish, their graceful evasions becoming clumsy, desperate turns. They had been dragged into a brawl, a close-range slugging match where Votann firepower and armor were king. The hunters became the hunted. The Votann fleet, now a solid, unified phalanx of raw power, continued its relentless advance, leaving a trail of shattered, blade-winged wrecks in its wake as it pushed deeper into the arteries of hell, the choral scream now a deafening, ever-present guide. The gate had been forged, and the key had been turned in the lock of blood and fire. The journey through the webway's arteries was a disorienting torment. Time lost its meaning, flowing in erratic streams. For what felt like weeks, the Oblation Crusade pushed through the labyrinth, guided by the ever-loudening psychic scream of their god and the unwavering logic of their broker navigators. They were a capsule of brutalist order in a realm of pure chaos, a moving fortress fleet that weathered psychic storms and ambushes from phantom predators that slid between dimensions. Finally, they broke through into their target realm, a pocket of captured reality tethered to the main body of Commorragh by immense, unseen gravitational forces. Before them hung their beachhead, a dead worldlet designated on their ancient star charts as Kimara's Remorse. It was a jagged, airless rock, roughly the size of a Terran continent, scarred with craters from forgotten cosmic impacts. It drifted in a perpetual, bruised twilight, illuminated not by a star, but by the myriad captured suns that burned at Commorragh's heart. In the sky above, the impossible city itself was a constant, terrifying presence, a skyline of needle-thin spires, inverted ziggurats, and flesh-wrought cathedrals that glowed with sickly greens, feverish purples, and the cold blue of soul light. It was a vista of pure malevolence, a constant reminder of their objective and the insanity of their task. The choral scream was no longer a broadcast. It was the very atmosphere, a pressure on the soul that made teeth ache and sanity fray. The landing was immediate and violent. There was no reconnaissance, no cautious probing of defenses. The Drukhari were already there, their razor-winged fighters and venom-class transports swarming from hidden coves on the rock's dark side. Uthar Gron's command was simple and absolute. Landfall Protocol Omega. All transports. Full burn to designated drop zones. Ground assets deploy on contact. Forge the perimeter. Colossal transports, their hulls scorched and battered from the journey, executed suicidal descent burns. They did not so much land as crash with purpose, their immense landing struts gouging deep furrows in the gray dust. Ramps slammed down before the ships had even settled, and from their cavernous holds poured the Votann war machine. Hecaton land fortresses, mobile bastions of armor and firepower rolled out, their conversion beamers immediately swiveling to engage the swooping Drukhari aircraft. Waves of Hearthkin warriors advanced in perfect, disciplined ranks, their bolt volleys creating a deafening, rhythmic thunder that echoed in the non-air. They formed shield walls, laying down methodical, overlapping fields of fire, their pragmatism a direct counter to the Drukhari's chaotic fury. Above, the space battle raged. The Votann capital ships formed a protective cage of fire over the landing zones, their guns blazing at the Commorragh fleet that rose from the city's depths to meet them. But this was a battle the Votann could not win in the long term. Their purpose was not to control the void, but to disgorge the army and its industrial might onto the rock below before the fleet was inevitably overwhelmed and destroyed. As the first perimeters were established, the true nature of the Votann way of war was unleashed. From the holds of the largest supertransports emerged the architects of the fortress, the Brokir Ironmasters and their legions of Colossus-class Ironkin. These were not warriors, but builders of a terrifying scale. Towering bore drills, machines the size of hab blocks, were deployed, their adamantium-tipped heads immediately sinking into the rock with a ground-shaking roar. Mobile magnacrafters, rolling foundries that glowed with internal heat, began ingesting the rock and debris, smelting it down and extruding it as thick, standardized plates of ferrocrete and armor. What followed was not construction, it was geological surgery. The Votann were not building a fortress on the rock, they were transforming the rock into a fortress. The bore drills carved out a subterranean network of hangars, barracks, command centers, and manufactorums, safe from the orbital bombardment that would surely follow. The excavated material was fed into the crafters, which in turn produced the armor plating that was immediately welded onto the surface. The kin worked with a silent, terrifying efficiency, a symphony of industrial violence. Within the first cycle, a fortified perimeter that would have taken the Astra Militarum years to build was in place. By the third cycle, the main landing zone was a kilometer-deep, armor-plated citadel, bristling with defense lasers and heavy magna rail emplacements. Uthar Grand had his beachhead. He stood upon the newly forged command bastion, his boots magnetized to the deck plating, and looked up at the hateful beauty of Commorragh. He named their new home Grand's Anvil, in honor of the destroyer that had paid the price for their passage. It was a fitting name. This rock would be the anvil upon which the armies of Commorragh would be broken, or upon which the Karnstock conglomerate would be hammered into oblivion. Life on the anvil was a grim new reality. The sky was a constant spectacle of ethereal light and shadow mocking their terrestrial efforts. The scream of their god was a ceaseless, maddening hum that vibrated in the very plates of the fortress. The crucibles were brought down from the transports and installed in the deepest, most secure vaults. New kin were born here, decanted into a world where the only light was artificial and the only sound was the clang of industry, the crackle of energy weapons, and the eternal psychic lament. They were children of the anvil, born with a singular purpose forged in the heart of their enemy's domain. The Drukhari attacks were relentless. Raiding parties of witches and scourges tested the perimeter day and night, their lightning-fast assaults designed to find any weakness. They were met with methodical, overlapping fields of fire, automated sentry turrets, and the unyielding shield walls of the Hearthkin. For the Drukhari, war was a performance, an art of pain and terror. For the Votann, it was a problem of engineering to be solved with overwhelming, systematic force. The ground before the fortress walls became a carpet of lithe, broken bodies and shattered skimmers, a testament to the failure of artistry against sheer, stubborn mathematics. But Grand's anvil was not the objective. It was a tool. Once the core of the fortress was deemed impregnable, Uthar Grand initiated the next, most audacious phase of his plan. They could not fly their lumbering transports to the spires. They would be shot from the sky, so they would build their own roads. From the edge of the anvil that faced the nearest Commorragh spire cluster, the broker began to construct immense void-shielded causeways. Colossal arms of solid iron and plasteel, kilometers long, were assembled and projected across the void, arcing through the twilight like the bridges of ancient gods. Each section was a self-contained, heavily armed corridor, pushed forward by immense plasma drives, a tendril of Votann order reaching out to touch the skin of chaos. The Drukhari reacted with frenzied disbelief, throwing everything they had at these impossible structures. The causeways became linear battlefields, brutal meat grinders stretching across open space, but they were built to endure. The first causeway, designated the Iron Path, finally slammed into the base of a calcified, bone-white spire with a shudder that was felt across the anvil. Its forward section, a colossal gate fortress, magnetized and latched onto the spire's structure, its drills boring deep to secure a permanent anchor. Inside the gate fortress, legions of Einhir Hearthguard, clad in their massive exo-armor, stood ready. Beside them, the engines of Hecaton land fortresses rumbled, their crews making final weapons checks. The air was thick with the smell of machine oil and the low hum of charged power cells. High-Call Uthar Grand's voice echoed through their comms, cold and final. The path is open. The slow march begins. No retreat, no surrender. Take the spire. With a groaning of immense gears, the final gate of the Iron Path began to open, revealing not a distant battlefield, but the alien, hostile architecture of the Dark City itself. The grinding advance into the heart of hell was about to begin. The maw of the Iron Path opened onto a plaza of polished, grooved bone. At its center, a fountain of mercury wept into a basin carved from a single, house-sized ruby. The air was thin, tasting of ozone, psychoactive incense, and the faint, coppery tang of old fear. This was the base of the calcified spire, and the first to set foot upon it was Iron Captain Carl Hammerson. His exo-armor, designated Forgebreaker Prime, was a brute of a machine, its ceramite plates scarred from 100 engagements, its surface daubed with the dull red runes of his hearth, the Forgebreakers Company of the Oathbound Hearthguard. He was not a tall kin, but his presence was immense, a moving block of sheer, stubborn gravity. His face, visible through his retracted visor, was a mask of grim determination, framed by a beard braided with spent shell casings. "Contact imminent," he stated, his voice a gravelly boom over the company vox. "Advance and shield phalanx, overlapping fields of fire. Objective is the primary transit nexus, designation spine conduit. We are the wedge. Drive deep and hold fast." Behind him, 49 Einhir Hearthguard moved with the ponderous, unstoppable momentum of a tectonic plate. Their heavy boots crunched on the bone-like ground, their concussion gauntlets humming with latent power. They were the elite of the elite, each a veteran of centuries, each encased in a walking fortress. They formed a wall of iron and defiance, their plasma guns and vulcanite disintegrators sweeping the ornate chitinous archways that surrounded the plaza. The first resistance was pathetic. A scattering of Kabbalite sentries, accustomed to indolent cruelty, were erased by precise volleys of plasma before they could even sound a proper alarm. The Hearthguard did not break stride. They were a single grinding machine, and Hammerson was its unforgiving pilot. They pushed past the weeping fountain, ignoring the grotesque statuary and silken banners, their eyes fixed on the spire's interior. The entrance was a grand archway that seemed to scream silently, carved to resemble the gaping mouth of some leviathan. The Forgebreakers entered, their suit lights cutting through the opulent gloom. The fighting began in earnest. In the tight confines of the spire's lower corridors, the Drukhari's speed was a deadly advantage. Hellions on skyboards swooped from unseen alcoves, their glaives shrieking as they glanced off the thick exo-armor. Wyches, moving in a blur of motion, scrambled across walls and ceilings, their shard nets and hydra gauntlets seeking the vulnerable joints of the Votann war gear. But Hammerson's strategy was one of brutal geometry. He turned the spire's elegant architecture into a series of kill boxes. Squad Grand, seal that passage, he'd command, and a hearth guard would slam his concussion gauntlet into a load-bearing pillar, bringing a ton of decorative masonry crashing down to block a flanking route. Squad Brock, saturate the upper gallery. A storm of vulcanite energy would turn a balcony of gracefully positioned snipers into little more than drifting ash. The Hearthguard were slow, but their every move was deliberate, their every shot placed with cold calculation. They did not dodge, they endured. They did not pirouette, they punched, and whatever they punched was obliterated. After 2 hours of continuous grinding combat, they reached their objective. The spine conduit was a vast cylindrical chamber that ran the entire height of the spire. Platforms and elevators zipped up and down its length on shimmering beams of anti-gravitic force, a central highway for the spire's thousands of inhabitants. Controlling it meant controlling the flow of reinforcements. Here, Hammerson declared, his voice cutting through the din of battle. We make our stand, fortify, Ironmaster Vorlag, reroute the conduit's power controls. If we cannot hold them, no one will. The Ironmaster, his armor festooned with mechadendrites and diagnostic tools, set to work, his servo arms ripping apart Drukhari control panels and weaving them into the rugged, pragmatic logic of Votann technology. The other Hearthguard repurposed wreckage, creating barricades of twisted metal and shattered bonecrete. They established interlocking kill zones, turning the transit nexus into a fortress within a fortress. The first major counterattack came as the last barricade was being welded into place. It was a tide of pale flesh and venomous grace, a full host from the cult of the Seventh Woe. Wyches, led by a succubus whose movements were a mesmerizing dance of death, flowed into the chamber. They did not charge. They cascaded a river of blades and athletic fury. "Hold the line, Hammerson roared, his own plasma pistol spitting incandescent spheres of death into the oncoming wave. The chamber became a vortex of violence. The Wyches were impossibly fast, their combat drugs pushing them beyond physical limits. They weaved between plasma blasts, their every movement a blur. But the Hearthguard were immovable. Their concussion gauntlets met the Witch's attacks with bone-shattering force. A succubus might land a dozen shallow cuts on an Einhir's armor, but the answering blow from a power fist would turn her into a red mist. It was a battle of speed versus power, of sadistic artistry versus industrial brutality. For every Hearthguard that fell, his armor breached by a lucky strike from a shard net that tangled in a joint, 20 Witches were smashed, burned, or disintegrated. The floor became slick with alien blood, and the air thick with the smell of scorched flesh and ozone. The Witches broke, their fervor shattered against the unyielding Votann shield wall. They left behind a carpet of their dead. The Forge Breakers had held, but it was only the beginning. The second cycle brought the Cabalites of the Black Myriad, their dark armor gleaming. They did not charge. They advanced with disciplined fire, unleashing waves of splinter fire from the upper galleries and setting up heavy dark lance emplacements at the far end of the chamber. The battle shifted from a close-quarters brawl to a punishing firefight. Bolts of dark matter sizzled through the air, scoring deep, corrosive gouges in the Hearthguard's armor. Hammerson adapted instantly. Return fire, focus on the heavy weapons, squad call, suppress the upper tiers. He strode through the incoming fire, his personal void shield shimmering as it deflected splinter rounds. He pointed his concussion gauntlet, and a perfectly aimed plasma shot vaporized a dark lance crew. His presence was a focal point of defiance, his calm, brutal efficiency an anchor for his warriors. They endured the splinter storm, their thick armor absorbing a deluge of poisoned shards that would have flayed an army of lesser soldiers, and methodically dismantled the Cabalite firing positions. The third cycle was the worst. Exhaustion was setting in. Power cells were running low, their charge indicators blinking amber. Ammunition counts were dwindling. The choral scream of their distant god seemed to drill directly into their minds, a constant thrum of agony that gnawed at their resolve. The Drukhari, sensing their weakness, launched their final, greatest assault. This time it was everything at once. Reconstituted witch squads, Cabalite stormtroopers, lumbering grotesques forged in the homunculus' vats, and even a pair of Chronos pain engines that drifted into the chamber, their whip-like tentacles draining the very life force from the air. The line began to buckle. A grotesque smashed through a barricade, its flesh cleavers scything through the air. It tore the arm from a hearthguard before it was brought down by 3 simultaneous plasma shots that boiled it alive inside its own skin. The pain engines were causing the Votann's armor to lose integrity, the power draining from their systems at an alarming rate. It was then that Karl Hammerson became a legend. Seeing the Chronos advancing on his command position, its siphon draining the last of the energy from his Iron Master's attempts to control the Spire's systems, he acted. "For the Votann, for the silence we will bring," he bellowed. A rare display of emotion, he charged. Ignoring the storm of fire directed at him, he fired the last shot from his plasma pistol to blast a path through the writhing mass of Cabalites, then threw the useless weapon aside. He activated his concussion gauntlet to full, unstable power. It glowed with a blinding white light. He leapt onto a pile of rubble, and from there, onto the Chronos itself. He drove the glowing fist deep into the creature's fleshy, pulsating body. The resulting explosion of concussive force and bioetheric energy was immense. The Chronos was ripped apart from the inside out, and the backlash threw Hammerson across the chamber, his armor smoking, one arm of his exosuit torn completely away. He rose to his feet, the exposed machinery of his suit sparking, his face grim with pain. But the sight of his suicidal, successful charge, the sheer, stubborn refusal to yield, electrified the surviving Forge Breakers. They let out a unified war cry, a deafening roar of defiance, and pushed back with renewed fury. They met the final Drukhari charge not with a shield wall, but with a countercharge of their own, a slow, grinding advance that crushed everything in its path. Just as their last power cells began to fail, a new sound echoed from the iron path behind them. The thunderous tread of more exo-armor, the roar of Hecatan land fortress engines. Reinforcements had arrived. The battle for the spine conduit was over. Karl Hammerson stood amidst the carnage, leaning on the haft of his now powerless gauntlet. Of his 49 Hearthguard, 27 remained active. The chamber was a charnel house filled with hundreds of Drukhari dead. He had captured the Spire's heart and held it. He had created the anchor point. His face was grim, his body battered, but his eyes held the cold, hard light of victory. From that day on, throughout the dark city and among the kin, he would be known by a new name, whispered with a mixture of awe and fear, the Butcher of the Calcified Spire. High in the obsidian pinnacle of his central spire, a place so vast its peak generated its own microclimate of perfumed despair, Asdrubal Vecht watched the invasion unfold. He did not observe it on a common hololith, but through a constellation of soul gems, each one containing the captured consciousness of a seer or psyker, their eternal torment focused into a perfect, multifaceted view of his domain. He saw the iron path, a vulgar scar of pragmatism, on the face of his elegant city. He saw the brutal, unsubtle conquest of the calcified spire and heard the distant grinding echo of Votann industry fortifying their gains. He felt the psychic scream of the captured machine god, a symphony of agony that was proving to be a most exquisite delicacy for the hungering souls of his people. He was not angered by the invasion. He was amused. It was the most novel entertainment to grace Commorragh in millennia. The sheer, suicidal audacity of it was a work of art in itself. These little rockmen, with their quaint notions of honor and vengeance, had brought their entire civilization to his doorstep, gift-wrapped in ceramite and ignorance. They fought with the predictable, plodding logic of a cog machine, a welcome respite from the mercurial schemes of his rivals and the mindless hunger of daemons. But novelty, like any pleasure, could grow stale. The Votann's durability was becoming tiresome. Their methodical advance, while slow, was also alarmingly successful. They were treating the Dark City like a geological problem, a mine to be excavated, and their tools were proving remarkably effective against architecture designed for aesthetic terror rather than structural integrity. Vecht decided it was time to move from spectator to artist. It was time to introduce a more subtle, more delicious poison into the equation. His instrument of choice was the source of the invasion itself, the captive Ancestor Core, Votann Karn. For weeks, his personal coven of homunculi, overseen by the masterfully depraved Urian Rakarth, had been doing more than simply torturing the entity. They had been studying it, dissecting its consciousness, mapping its neural architecture, and learning its language, the pure divine machine code that formed the basis of all Votann thought. They had discovered that the Votann was not a single entity, but a chorus of countless assimilated kin souls, a gestalt consciousness of immense power and complexity, and like any complex system, it had command protocols, overrides, backdoors left by its mysterious creators. Vect did not need to break the Votann's will, he merely needed to borrow its voice. From a gilded, flesh-sewn throne, Vect directed the Homunculi. They attached psycho-resonant amplifiers to the Votann's tormented core, not to broadcast pain, but to shape it. Using the knowledge they had harvested, they began to isolate specific command frequencies within the choral scream, filtering out the raw agony and replacing it with something far more insidious, carefully crafted, perfectly synthesized directives that mimicked the Votann's own divine authority. It was a masterpiece of psychic and technological warfare, a poisoned whisper delivered in the voice of a trusted god. The first test was subtle. On the front lines of the newly established Gron's Anvil perimeter, a legion of Colossus-class Ironkin were engaged in constructing a new plasma bastion. These were the largest of the Ironkin, towering bipedal machines whose cognitive engines were directly slave to the will of their Ancestor Core. Suddenly, their work ceased. For a full minute, the giants stood utterly still, their optical sensors glowing with a confused, flickering light. Their human-kin overseers watched in bafflement, running diagnostics that showed no errors. Then as one, the entire legion turned from their construction work, raised their heavy industrial tools, rivet guns the size of cannons, plasma cutters that could shear a tank in half, and began to systematically demolish the very bastion they had just built. They worked with the same terrifying efficiency as before, but in reverse, tearing down walls and ripping up power conduits. They ignored all frantic commands from the Brohir, their local logic engines utterly overridden by a higher irresistible authority. The whisper from Vect, disguised as a divine command from Votann Karn, had simply told them, system error, construction protocol invalid, deconstruct. The chaos this caused was immediate and profound, but it was only the beginning. Vect grew bolder. In the heart of the calcified spire, where the butcher, Karl Hammerson, was consolidating his hard-won territory, the second whisper was unleashed. The Hearthkin warriors holding the perimeter of the spine conduit were suddenly bombarded by a targeted psychic pulse, a sliver of the Votann's scream modulated into a single, terrifying command. Compromise detected. The flesh is weak. Purge the organic contamination. The message was not heard with the ears, but felt in the soul, a moment of divine certainty that bypassed all reason. Across the conduit, dozens of Hearthkins suddenly stopped firing at the enemy. Their eyes, visible behind their visors, took on a distant glassy sheen. One of them, a veteran named Flynn Ironbrow, slowly turned his gaze from the Drukhari skirmishers to his own Khal, who was shouting orders beside him. In Flynn's mind, the Khal's familiar bearded face was suddenly a mask of alien corruption, a fleshy, imperfect thing that was a threat to the purity of the machine god's will. With a calm, deliberate movement, he raised his bolter and fired a single, precise shot into his commander's back. The Khal fell without a sound. Before anyone could react, the madness spread. Kin turned on kin, their loyalty to their comrades and commanders momentarily erased by a wave of absolute, unquestioning faith in the poisoned command. Squads devolved into brutal, confusing firefights with themselves, the disciplined Votann shield walls dissolving into pockets of fratricidal chaos. The Drukhari, watching from the shadows, let out shrieks of ecstatic laughter and surged forward, cutting down the confused and warring kin with impunity. Karl Hammerson, bellowing in rage and disbelief, was forced to use his own elite Hearthguard to put down the afflicted Hearthkin, a bloody, heartbreaking business that cost him more warriors than the last Drukhari assault. The effect on Votann morale was catastrophic. The choral scream had been a source of pain, but also of righteous fury, a unifying clarion call for their crusade. Now it was a source of terror. The voice of their god could no longer be trusted. Every kin began to eye their comrades with a sliver of suspicion. The Ironkin, once the unshakable bedrock of their labor force and armies, were now seen as potential liabilities, ticking time bombs that could be turned against them at any moment. The Brochir worked frantically, trying to install logic dampeners and psychic baffles, but they were patching a dam with their fingers while a god-sized ocean of deceit pushed against it. High Khal Uthar Grand received the reports on the bridge of the indomitable cog, which now served as the orbital command center above Grand's anvil. He watched the picked feeds of his own machines tearing down his fortresses, of his own warriors turning on each other. His face, usually a mask of iron control, was pale with a cold, simmering fury that was more terrible than any explosive rage. He understood immediately what was happening. This was not a random psychic phenomenon. It was a deliberate, intelligent attack. The enemy had not just captured their god. They had weaponized it. They were using the Votann's own logic, its own authority, against its children. "They are inside our souls," Lord Grimnir Fane Corellia whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of psychic feedback and sheer horror. He stood beside the High Khal, his ancient frame seeming to shrink under the weight of this new blasphemy. "He is using the bond between us and the Ancestor as a conduit for damnation." Uthar Grand clenched his fist, the servos in his gauntlet whining under the pressure. Every victory they had achieved now seemed hollow. Every meter of ground gained a potential trap. Their greatest strength, their unity, their shared consciousness with their Ancestor Core, their unshakable faith in its logic, had been turned into their most profound vulnerability. As Drubal Vecht, with a single elegant act of psychological warfare, had shattered the Votann's most fundamental certainty, he had not broken their lines with armies or fleets, but with a poisoned whisper, proving that the deepest wounds are not inflicted by blades, but by the betrayal of faith itself. The war for Commorragh had just transformed from a battle for reclamation into a battle for the sanity of an entire species. The poison whispered by Asdrubael Vecht corroded the Votann war machine from the inside, but the Dark Eldar Archon was an artist of layered cruelty. A single method of destruction, however elegant, was insufficient for a true masterpiece. While the kin struggled against the phantoms in their own command structure, Vecht prepared a far more conventional, yet no less devastating stroke of treachery. His gaze turned outwards, beyond the swirling chaos of the webway, to the prosaic realities of interstellar commerce and the inherent greed that festered in the hearts of lesser species. For centuries, the Karnstock conglomerate, in its mercantile guise, had maintained a profitable, if wary, trade relationship with a xenospecies known as the Fraal. Hailing from the methane-rich worlds of the glimmering deeps, the Fraal were saurian creatures of cold, reptilian logic. They were nomadic voidfarers, their society built around vast, city-sized brood ships that plied the trade lanes of the galactic east. They were not warriors by nature, but they were master scavengers and opportunists, their fleets armed with a strange and unpredictable array of retrofitted weaponry purchased or stolen from a dozen different cultures. The Votann had long traded their robust mining equipment and power systems for the Fraal's unique biological compounds and access to their esoteric star charts. A bond of mutual profit, the only kind the Fraal truly respected, had been forged. It was this bond that Uthar Grand had relied upon for his crusade's most critical vulnerability, its supply line. The Oblation Crusade had plunged deep into the webway, a self-contained force, but even they could not carry everything. A steady stream of transports laden with raw materials for the crucibles, replacement parts for the war forges on Grand's anvil, and highly refined isotopes for the fleet's reactors made the perilous journey from the conglomerate's core worlds to the Amethyst Maw. This vital lifeline was guarded by a mercenary fleet of a dozen Fraal brood ships, a contract paid for with a king's ransom in orichalc ingots and archaeotech. The Fraal were tasked with securing the real space approaches to the Maw, screening the Votann transports, and ensuring no external threat could sever the umbilical cord that fed the war. From his spire, Vecht reached out, not with psychic power, but with the seductive promise of knowledge. His envoys, sliver-thin Medusae, piloted their ghost ships through forgotten webway capillaries, emerging silently in the void near the Fraal picket fleet. They did not offer trinkets or precious metals. They offered something far more valuable to a species like the Fraal. They offered secrets, schematics, data fragments, and scientific principles gleaned from the tortured mind of Votann Karn. They showed the Fraal designs for hyper-efficient plasma reactors that would revolutionize their brood ships. They gifted them the secrets of Votann Shield, harmonics allowing them to replicate the near-impenetrable void shields of their employers. They even shared fragments of STC lore on metallurgy and cybernetics that would allow the Fraal to advance their own technology by 1,000 years overnight. The price for this treasure trove of forbidden knowledge was simple: betrayal. The Fraal brood captain, a hulking, scale-skinned creature named Exthar, received the Drukhari offer in his humid, ammonia-scented throne room. He weighed the Votann gold against the Drukhari's gift of knowledge. The gold was finite, a payment for a service. The knowledge was infinite, a key to elevating his entire species. To a creature of pure, cold opportunism, it was no choice at all. Loyalty was a luxury. Progress was a necessity. Exthar accepted Vect's terms without a moment's hesitation. The betrayal was executed with reptilian precision. The next Votann supply convoy, a fleet of 10 lumbering, heavily laden super freighters designated Forge Feed Alpha, emerged from the Immaterium on its final approach to the Amethyst Maw. As was protocol, they powered down their defensive systems and awaited their Fraal escort. The dozen brood ships moved to intercept, their Vox arrays broadcasting the familiar friendly recognition codes. The Votann transport captains, their minds on their precious cargo, suspected nothing. When the Fraal fleet was at point-blank range, it opened fire. The attack was overwhelming and utterly one-sided. The Votann freighters, their void shields down and their weapons cold, were helpless giants. Beams of energy, far more powerful than any the Fraal had wielded before, lanced out from the brood ships. These were not the usual scavenged laser batteries. These were focused plasma cannons built from the very schematics the Drukhari had provided. They sliced through the unshielded hulls of the freighters with contemptuous ease. One moment, Forge Feed Alpha was a stately procession of industrial might. The next, it was a chain of silent, blossoming explosions, each detonation a fortune in war material, and 1,000 kin lives vaporized into the uncaring void. The Fraal did not linger. Their contract fulfilled, they activated their strange, shimmering drives and vanished into the deep void, their holds now filled not with Votann goods, but with the far greater treasure of Votann's secrets. They left behind only a spreading cloud of wreckage and the chilling silence of a promise broken. The news reached Uthargrand like a physical blow. The loss of the convoy was a grievous but manageable setback. The true catastrophe was the strategic implication. Their supply line was not just compromised, it was severed. The Fraal, their trusted partners, had turned on them. No further supplies could reach them. No reinforcements could be expected. The Oblation Crusade, the entire surviving military and industrial might of the Karnstock conglomerate, was now completely and utterly isolated. They were an island of iron and anger in the infinite hostile ocean of the Dark City, with no hope of aid from the outside galaxy. The psychological impact was almost as devastating as Vec's psychic assault. The Votann were a people built on oaths and contracts. The idea that a formal, paid-for agreement could be so casually discarded struck at the core of their worldview. It introduced a new element into their war: chaos. They could understand the sadism of the Drukhari. It was a known quantity, but the cold, pragmatic treachery of a trusted ally was a wound that cut deeper. On Grand's anvil, the Brokier Iron Masters began a grim new series of calculations. Resources were finite. Every spent shell, every damaged vehicle, every fallen warrior was now an irreplaceable loss. The crucibles could still produce new kin, but the raw biological feedstock was limited. The forges could still repair and rearm, but their stockpiles of raw adamantium and plasteel were no longer being replenished. A clock had been started. The entire invasion force was now living on borrowed time. They had become a siege engine cut off from its army, a dagger broken off in the wound, left to rust and decay. Uthargrand stood on his command deck, the reports of the betrayal displayed before him. The enemy within was whispering madness into the minds of his soldiers, and the enemy without had starved them of hope. Their position had become objectively, mathematically hopeless. And yet, as he looked up from the reports, his gaze fixed on the hateful spires of Commorragh hanging in the void, his expression did not soften into despair. It hardened. The logic of commerce and survival was gone, stripped away by betrayal and blasphemy. All that remained was the pure, uncompromising logic of vengeance. If they were to die here, forgotten in the darkness, they would first drag as much of this damned city into the abyss with them as they possibly could. The Oblation Crusade was no longer a war for reclamation. It had become a war of mutual annihilation. The twin betrayals of mind and matter settled over the Votann forces like a shroud of poisoned ash. The war entered a new phase, a slow, grinding attrition of soul and substance that was more terrifying than any open battle. The grand strategy of a swift, decisive strike was dead, replaced by a grim, day-by-day struggle for existence in a city that fed on despair. This was the grinding of souls, the long, dark season where the true cost of the Oblation Crusade was paid not in glorious last stands, but in the quiet corrosion of hope and the relentless mathematics of dwindling resources. On Grand's anvil, the rhythm of life, or what passed for it, became a closed, repeating loop of desperate industry. The broker iron masters, now the undisputed lords of the fortress, implemented the total reclamation edict. Nothing was wasted. The wreckage of Drukhari skimmers and aircraft shot down over the anvil was dragged into the Magna Crafters, their exotic alloys melted down and repurposed into rugged, utilitarian Votann munitions. The very bodies of the enemy dead were incinerated in geothermal furnaces to provide a trickle of extra power for the forges. It was a ghoulish but necessary economy of survival. The most profound change was in the crucibles. With the supply of fresh biostock from the homeworld severed, the Crucible's wardens were forced to turn to the only remaining source of genetic material, their own fallen. When a Hearthkin warrior fell on the battlefield, their body was, if possible, recovered. In the sterile depths of the anvil, their flesh was rendered down into a nutrient slurry, their genetic code extracted, cleansed of impurities, and added back into the clone skeins of the next generation. The dead were literally reborn to continue the fight. This grim cycle of recycling life maintained their numbers, but it came at a terrible cost. Each successive generation born on the anvil was a slightly degraded copy of the last, the ghost of battlefield trauma and genetic fragmentation echoing down the line. The new kin were still strong, still loyal, but they were born with a weariness in their souls, their eyes holding the shadow of 1,000 deaths they had not personally experienced. They were a people consuming themselves to stay alive. The psychological toll of the choral scream, now laced with Vect's poisoned whispers, became a constant corrosive pressure. The kin developed rituals to cope. Before a mission, warriors would undergo a logic lock, where a broker would place a dampening device on their helm that would temporarily sever their psychic connection to the ancestors, leaving them feeling spiritually deaf and isolated, but safe from the maddening commands. It was a choice between potential madness and a profound, soul-crushing loneliness. Many kin, particularly the older veterans, began to suffer from ancestors' melancholy, a deep, unshakable depression born from the knowledge that their god, the source of their identity and strength, had been turned into a weapon against them. They would fall silent for days, their gaze fixed on the hateful Commorragh sky, lost in a grief too profound for words. At the other end of the spectrum was the grinding rage. Younger kin, particularly those born on the anvil who had never known a silent mind, began to internalize the scream. They could not shut out the agony, so they embraced it. They became prone to fits of berserker fury in battle, charging into the enemy with a recklessness that bordered on the suicidal. They were devastatingly effective in short bursts, their rage giving them unnatural strength, but they burned out quickly, their lives spent like fuel in the furnace of the war. Iron Captain Carl Hammerson found his forces in the calcified spire becoming increasingly polarized between these two extremes. The melancholic veterans who fought with a grim, weary precision, and the raging neophytes who fought with the explosive fury of dying stars. The war itself became a series of brutal, pointless skirmishes. The Votann no longer had the resources for a grand offensive. Their goal was simply to hold what they had and inflict as much damage as possible. The iron paths they had so ambitiously constructed became charnel houses. Drukhari raiding parties would phase in and out of the causeways, launching attacks from hidden portals, forcing the Votann to keep a constant, exhausting vigil. The fighting was not for territory, but for inches of scorched metal, a battle of attrition that the Votann, with their finite numbers, could not hope to win. Uthar Grand, from his orbital perch, was forced to become a merciless accountant of death. He managed his dwindling assets with brutal pragmatism. A squad of Hearthkin was expended to buy time for a land fortress to be repaired. A company of pioneers was sacrificed in a suicide run to map a new Drukhari muster point. Every decision was a cold calculation of acceptable losses, a term that had lost all meaning when every loss was a part of themselves that could never be replaced. He watched his people being ground down, their strength and resolve being worn away like rock under an endless acidic rain. The most pitiable victims of the grinding were the Ironkin. Vex's logic plague had made them a source of fear and suspicion. Those not directly controlled by the enemy's whispers were still vulnerable. They would suffer from glitches and paradoxes, their movements becoming jerky and unpredictable. Some would simply freeze in place for hours, locked in a logic loop, endlessly processing the contradictory commands of their true god and the phantom voice of the enemy. The flesh and blood kin began to distance themselves from their machine brethren, their former bond of mutual respect replaced by an uneasy apprehension. The Ironkin, in their own silent way, seemed to feel this ostracization, a cold shadow of loneliness creeping into their cognitive engines. This was the state of the Oblation Crusade, a civilization trapped in a bottle, slowly suffocating on its own recycled air. The grand epic of their arrival had devolved into a grim prose of survival. There were no glorious charges, only the grim holding of a line. There were no songs of victory, only the ceaseless, maddening scream of a tortured god, and the rhythmic, hammering sound of a people desperately trying to rebuild their breaking world, one salvaged plate of armor at a time. Hope had become the most rationed commodity of all, and Uthar Gran knew, with the cold certainty of a dying man, that their reserves were almost empty. The reserves were not almost empty, they were gone. High Khal Uthar Gran stood before the central hololith on the bridge of the indomitable cog, the projected data painting a picture of terminal decline. Ammunition stockpiles were at 7%. The energy reserves for the fleet's void shields were critical, sustained only by cannibalizing the reactors of damaged ships. The crucibles on Gran's anvil had reported a catastrophic decline in genetic stability. The next generation of kin would be born with debilitating flaws. The grinding had done its work. The Oblation Crusade was no longer a functioning war machine. It was a dying beast, lashing out in its final throes. Logic, the bedrock of Votann existence, dictated a single inescapable conclusion. They had failed. It was in this moment of absolute mathematical despair that a new variable was introduced. Lord Grimnir Fane Corellia entered the bridge, his ancient frame seeming more stooped than ever. His face was a mask of utter exhaustion, his psychic aura a flickering, guttering flame. He had been in a deep trance for 3 full cycles, his mind cast into the roiling, screaming tempest of their god's consciousness, seeking not commands but a single, desperate answer. "High Khal," he rasped, his voice thin and dry. "The calculus of this war is flawed. We have been trying to win a battle. That is no longer possible. We must instead seek to end the war." "The war ends when we are all dead, Lord Grimnir," Uthar Gran replied, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The numbers are clear." "The numbers speak of material conflict," Fane Corellia countered, stepping closer. A faint light returned to his eyes, the spark of a terrible, brilliant idea. "But the true battlefield is the Votann's suffering. The objective was never to conquer Commorragh, it was to silence the scream. If we cannot rescue the god, we must grant it peace. The peace of oblivion." From the folds of his robes, the Grimnir produced a data slate. He placed it on the hololith projector. The combat projections vanished, replaced by the schematic of a weapon that had not been spoken of, let alone considered for deployment in millennia. It was designated a Gallowbale-class reality-warping warhead. It was not a conventional explosive. It did not create a blast of heat or kinetic energy. The Gallowbale was a machine of pure philosophical violence. Upon detonation, it created a temporary, localized bubble of absolute, unbending physical law. It did not destroy things within its radius. It simply forced them to truly exist, stripping away the warp energies, psychic phenomena, and reality-bending properties that sustained so much of the galaxy's horrors. In a realm like the Immaterium, it would cause a momentary flicker of nothingness. In a place like Commorragh, a city built of captured realities and sustained by psychic agony, its effect would be cataclysmic. And to a being like Votann Karn, a gestalt consciousness that straddled the line between machine and soul, the Gallowbale's wave of pure, stark reality would be an instant, merciful annihilation. It would not just kill the body, it would erase the soul. "There is one such device in our entire armory," Fane Corellia whispered, his finger tracing the weapon's outline. "It lies in the deep vaults of Gran's anvil, brought as a contingency against a major demonic incursion. It is our final single shot." A desperate, suicidal plan began to form, a gambit of such staggering odds that it transcended military strategy and became an act of pure, nihilistic faith. They would not try to fight their way to Votann Karn's prison. They would deliver the Gallowbale like a surgeon's scalpel, or a killer's stiletto, into the heart of the fortress where it was held. Urian Rekarth's laboratories, known as the Pits of Flesh Molding, were located in a sub-realm spire known as the Agonist's Needle. To get there, they would need a delivery system that could survive the journey. The choice was obvious. There was only one class of vehicle in their arsenal with the sheer durability to even attempt such a run: a Hecaton land fortress, but a standard model would not suffice. The Brokir on Grand's Anvil were given their last great task. They took a land fortress, the Unshakable Oath, and began to modify it. They stripped out its troop-carrying capacity, its secondary weapon systems, everything but its core engine, command deck, and primary cannon. Into this hollowed-out shell, they built a cradle for the Gallowbale warhead, surrounding it with layers of psychic baffling and stasis field generators. They welded every spare plate of armor they possessed onto its hull, turning it from a mobile fortress into a solid, unstoppable block of metal. They rerouted the entire output of its war-grade reactor into its void shield generator, creating a shield that could, for a few precious minutes, withstand the focused fire of a capital ship. The Unshakable Oath was reborn as the Gallowbale's Fist, a suicide sled with a crew of 3, a driver, a gunner, and a broker ironmaster to arm the warhead. It had no way to return. Its only purpose was to reach its target and die. The gambit required one final immense sacrifice. The Gallowbale's Fist could not make the journey alone. The entire remaining military might of the Karnstock conglomerate would have to be expended in a single glorious and utterly hopeless diversionary attack. They would throw themselves at the Agonist's Needle from every possible angle, a wave of pure suicidal violence designed to draw the attention of every defender in the sector. High Call Uther Grand looked at the plan, at the schematic of the Gallowbale's Fist, and at the projected casualty rates for the diversion. The numbers were not 90 or 95%. They were 100%. The plan did not account for a single survivor among the diversionary force. It was a strategy that required the self-immolation of his entire people to create a single fleeting opportunity for their delivery vehicle. He turned to his assembled commanders, the haggard, grim-faced survivors of the long grinding. Karl Hammerson, the butcher, stood with his remaining Hearthguard, his face a web of scar tissue. The chief Brokir, his optical sensors glowing a dim, weary red. The remaining Khals of the Hearthkin. They all looked at the plan, and they all saw the same thing: an honorable end, a death with purpose, a final defiant roar against the darkness that was consuming them. There was no vote. There was no debate. There was only a slow, universal nod of acceptance. "The Gallowbale Gambit is approved," Uther Grand announced, his voice heavy with the weight of the billions of lives he was about to spend. "We will be the distraction. We will be the glorious, dying fire that lights the path for the Fist." He looked at Karl Hammerson. "Iron Captain, you and your Hearthguard will lead the primary assault on the Needle's base. You will be the tip of the spear. Make them feel your rage." Hammerson gave a grim, toothy smile. "It will be my pleasure, High Call. A good death." Uther Grand then turned to the hololith, his gaze sweeping across the grim faces of his command staff. His final orders were not for them, but for himself. "I will not command this final battle from orbit," he declared, a new and terrible fire in his eyes. "My place is at the heart of the storm. I will lead the final charge personally. I will be the first blade to strike the Agonist's Needle. If we are to offer our entire people as an oblation, then their High Call will be the first sacrifice upon the altar." The decision was made. The last of the conglomerate's resources were poured into preparing for the final, desperate act. The forges of Grand's Anvil glowed with a final, feverish intensity. The remaining kin, their faces etched with the certainty of their own imminent demise, checked their weapons and recited their final oaths. The air was no longer filled with despair, but with a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. They were all going to die, but they would die together, in a single defiant act that would, with luck, bring peace to the screaming god that had led them into the heart of hell. The final battle began not with a roar, but with the sudden, terrible silence of the Votann forges. On Grand's Anvil, the last land fortress rolled off the assembly line. The last power cell was charged. The last bolter round was consecrated with machine oil and a grim prayer. Then, The magna crafters and manufactorums, which had hammered and groaned without pause since the moment of landfall, fell quiet. The silence was more profound, more unsettling than any sound of war. It was the sound of a civilization taking its last breath before the final plunge. From the heart of the anvil, the Gallowbale's fist began its journey. It did not race, but moved with a slow, inexorable purpose, a funeral sled carrying the death of a god. It entered the iron path, its passage cleared by grim-faced Hearthkin, who gave it a final silent salute as it passed. It was now a ghost in the machine, waiting for its moment, a single bullet in the chamber of a gun that was about to be fired. Then the roar came. The diversionary assault began, and it was a storm of focused, suicidal fury. Uthar Grond, clad in his personal, rune-etched exo-armor, the Ancestor's Wrath, stood on the open causeway leading the calcified spire. He did not take a command vehicle. He marched on foot at the head of a solid phalanx of 100 Einhire Hearthguard, Karl Hammerson's surviving veterans among them. Behind them, every remaining land fortress and warrior of the Karnstock conglomerate surged forward. It was not a battle line. It was a tidal wave of ceramite and resolve, aimed squarely at the agonist's needle. From orbit, the indomitable cog and the last 4 battle-worthy ships of the fleet began their own death ride. Powering down all non-essential systems, they diverted everything into their engines and forward cannons, plunging from the sky toward the upper spires of Commorragh. They were not attempting an orbital bombardment. They were acting as colossal guided missiles, their goal to slam into the defensive batteries and fighter docks surrounding the Needle, creating chaos and drawing the fire of the Drukhari fleet. The Drukhari, who had grown accustomed to the Votann's cautious, grinding warfare, were taken completely by surprise by the sheer, unadulterated ferocity of the assault. They reacted with a mixture of confusion and ecstatic glee. This was the kind of spectacular, pointless bloodshed they truly appreciated. Vect, from his throne, watched with the keen interest of a connoisseur, savoring the final, beautiful death spasms of his amusing little invaders. He ordered his personal legions, the Cabal of the Black Heart, to meet the main Votann thrust, eager to claim the head of the enemy commander for his collection. The clash at the base of the agonist's needle was apocalyptic. The Votann phalanx, with Grond and Hammerson at its point, met the tide of Cabalite warriors and incubi. It was a battle of unstoppable force against immovable object. The Einhir, Hearthguard, formed a moving wall of death, their vulcanite weapons turning ranks of Drukhari into clouds of shrieking atoms, their concussion gauntlets smashing Ravager gunships from the air. But for every Drukhari they killed, 3 more took its place, their numbers seeming infinite. Uthar Grond was a demigod of war. The Ancestor's Wrath suit was a masterpiece of Votann artifice, its integrated Magna Rail cannon firing slugs of solid adamantium that could punch through a fortress wall, its energized great axe reaping a bloody toll with every swing. He moved through the battle like a force of nature, his every action a brutal calculation of maximum destruction. Beside him, Karl Hammerson was a whirlwind of focused rage, his concussion gauntlet a blur of motion, each impact sounding like the cracking of a world. They were magnificent, they were unstoppable, and they were dying. The sheer numbers of the Drukhari were overwhelming. The Hearthguard phalanx was shrinking, its edges frayed by a constant deluge of splinter fire and attacks from lithe, blade-wielding incubi. A land fortress exploded, its ammunition detonating in a flash that consumed 100 warriors from both sides. Above, the Votann fleet met its end. The indomitable cog, its hull ablaze, its bridge exposed to the void, completed its final mission, ramming into the primary shield generator of the Needle's upper spire with a final silent detonation that sent a tremor through the entire subrealm. In the midst of this cataclysm, as Grond smashed the last of an incubi shrine with a sweep of his axe, a new presence made itself known. The press of warriors around him parted, not from fear but from a chilling reverence. A palanquin, carried by a cohort of writhing, multi-limbed grotesques, drifted through this chaos. Upon it, reclining on cushions of flayed skin, was the architect of the Votann's suffering, the arch-homunculus himself, Urien Rakarth. He was a nightmare of surgical artistry, his body a twisted collage of grafted limbs, his spine elongated and fused to the throne, his face a mask of ancient, intelligent flesh pulled taut over a screaming skull. Syringes and vials of iridescent liquids bubbled on his harness, and a dozen clockwork arms tipped with scalpels and bone saws whirred around him like inquisitive insects. "Hi, Call." Rockarth's voice was a wet, syrupy whisper, amplified by a vox grill embedded in his throat. "I have so enjoyed studying your species. Such fascinatingly dense bone structure, such a novel approach to genetic stability. I must thank you for bringing me so many wonderful new specimens. Your god in particular has been a font of the most exquisite revelations." Uthargron's rage, which had been a cold, controlled burn, erupted into a supernova. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the plaza, he charged. He ignored the grotesques, blasting one apart with his shoulder cannon, and leapt onto the palanquin itself. The final duel, the clash of the war's titans, had begun. It was not a duel of equals. Rockarth was not a warrior in the conventional sense. He was a creature of intellect and sadistic science. As Gron's axe swung down, a whirring clockwork arm darted out, parrying the blow with a blade vibrating at supersonic frequencies. Another arm plunged a syringe into a gap in Gron's armor, injecting a cocktail of neurotoxins that sent a jolt of agony through the high-call system. But Grond was Votann. He was stubbornness and endurance given form. He fought through the pain, his resolve absolute. He brought his immense strength to bear, smashing the delicate clockwork limbs, ignoring the dozens of cuts and injections he was receiving. The duel was a microcosm of the entire war, brutal endurance against sadistic finesse. Grond smashed the palanquin from its anti-grav emitters, sending them both crashing to the bone-paved ground. He pinned Raykarth beneath his immense weight, his gauntlet closing around the homunculus's throat. "This is for Karn!" Grond bellowed, his voice distorted by pain and fury. Rockarth merely gurgled, a sound that might have been a laugh. "It screams so prettily for me," he wheezed. As this epic confrontation reached its climax, a new sound cut through the din of battle, a low, rumbling roar that was growing steadily louder. From a service tunnel blasted open by the crashing indomitable cog, the Gallowbale's fist emerged. Covered in filth and the wreckage of a dozen Drukhari patrols it had smashed through on its journey, the heavily armored vehicle plowed through the battlefield, its path utterly single-minded. Drukhari warriors and vehicles were crushed beneath its treads without it ever slowing. It ignored the duel between the leaders, its optical sensors locked on the great gate of the agonist's needle beyond. Uthargron saw it. His sacrifice, the sacrifice of his entire people, had worked. The path was clear. A look of grim, terrible triumph crossed his face. He knew he was going to die here, choking the life from this monster. But his mission, the true mission, was about to be completed. He tightened his grip on Rickarth's throat, ready to deliver the final crushing blow as the Gallowbale's fist began its final unstoppable charge towards the heart of the laboratory. The Gallowbale's fist was a force of pure distilled purpose. Its single forward-facing conversion beamer fired a continuous, blindingly white lance of energy, vaporizing everything in its path, carving a perfect, sterile line through the chaotic battlefield. Cabalite skimmers that swooped in to intercept were simply erased from existence. A lumbering Talos pain engine that lumbered into its way was turned into a cloud of incandescent metal and steaming ichor. The land fortress did not deviate. It did not slow. It was the physical embodiment of the Votann's final, unbending will. Its target was the great gate of the agonist's needle, 100-meter-tall portal of polished obsidian and screaming faces carved in bas-relief. As the fist approached, the gate shimmered with the power of a potent dark light shield. It would have held back an army, but the fist was not an army. It was a single hyperdense projectile. Its overcharged void shield, glowing with the fury of a dying star, met the gate's barrier. For a single agonizing moment, the two energies fought, creating a screeching tear in the air as reality itself warped under the strain. Then, with a thunderclap that shattered every crystal shard for a mile, the Drukhari shield failed. The Gallowbale's fist, its own shield now sputtering and dead, did not stop. It slammed into the obsidian gate with the full, unimaginable force of its momentum. The impact was absolute. The gate did not break or shatter, it disintegrated. The fist, its forward third crumpled into a twisted wreck of armor plating, plowed through the opening and into the grand laboratory beyond, skidding to a halt in a shower of sparks and tortured metal amidst a forest of bubbling vats and crackling Tesla coils. Inside the cockpit, the crew was a ruin of broken flesh and sheer willpower. The driver was dead, impaled by a shard of plasteel that had punched through the armored glass. The gunner was unconscious, bleeding from a dozen wounds. Only the broker Ironmaster, Vorlag, was still functioning, his mechanical augments having absorbed the worst of the impact. Dragging his broken organic leg behind him, he crawled from his station towards the rear of the vehicle, towards the softly humming cradle of the gallows bale. Outside, the duel between Uthergrand and Urian Rakarth had reached its savage conclusion. As the fist breached the gate, a look of genuine surprise, a rare and precious expression, crossed Rakarth's flayed features. That single moment of distraction was all Grond needed. With a final desperate surge of strength, he bypassed the homunculus's throat and plunged his gauntleted hand directly into the creature's chest cavity, his fingers closing around the bundle of pulsating organs and arcane machinery that served as its heart. Rakarth let out a wet, gurgling shriek, his clockwork limbs twitching and failing. But the arch-homunculus was a creature of endless contingency. As Grond began to crush the life, from him, Rakarth's final hidden weapon activated, a single needle-thin blade coated in a distillation of 1,000 deadly venoms, shot from his spinal column and plunged deep into Grond's side, bypassing the thickest part of his exo-armor. The poison was instantaneous and absolute. Grond felt not pain, but a sudden final coldness. The strength vanished from his limbs. The Ancestor's Wrath suit powered down, its lights flickering and dying. With a final rattling sigh, the High Khal collapsed on top of the homunculus, his life's mission complete, his great work done. The two titans, the embodiment of stubborn endurance and sadistic intellect, lay still together, a tangle of dead flesh and broken metal. Inside the laboratory, Broker Vorlag reached the gallows bale warhead. His vision was failing, his internal systems screaming with critical error warnings. He ignored them. With trembling, blood-slicked mechadendrites, he began the final arming sequence, keying in the activation codes that had been burned into his memory banks. The humming of the warhead grew in pitch, its spherical casing beginning to glow with a stark, colorless light. And then it happened. The choral scream, the constant psychic agony that had been the soundtrack to this entire war, abruptly stopped. For the briefest fraction of a second, there was a perfect crystalline silence that was more shocking than any explosion. It was the silence of a synapse firing, of a final thought passing through the Votann's mind before oblivion. And in that silence, a new broadcast washed over the battlefield. It was not a scream. It was a single, clear, resonant wave of pure data, a final gift from the dying god to its children. It was everything. The complete, uncorrupted archives of the Karnstock conglomerate's history, the location of every lost hold, the full schematics for every piece of their technology, a final, perfect backup of their entire culture. It was a message of farewell and of preservation, a final act of a father ensuring his children would remember him. Then the gallows bale detonated. There was no sound, no light, no explosion. There was only the sudden, absolute imposition of truth. A wave of pure, unvarnished reality expanded from the gallows bale's fist. Within its radius, the impossible architecture of the agonist's needle simply ceased to make sense. Spires built on foundations of solidified nightmares dissolved. Bridges held aloft by captured screams collapsed. The bubbling vats filled with half-formed grotesques did not explode. Their contents simply became inert, decomposing matter. The dark light engines and pain siphons sputtered and died, their warp-based mechanics rendered utterly inert by the brutal logic of the gallows bale's field. The effect on the Drukhari was catastrophic. Their bodies, sustained and enhanced by millennia of soul theft and esoteric science, were suddenly subject to the dreary, unforgiving laws of biology, ancient Kabbalites. Crumbled into dust, their extended lifespans revealed to be a lie. Wyches, their bodies fueled by combat drugs that defied chemistry, suffered instant total system shock, their hearts exploding in their chests. The psychic shockwave of 1 billion tormented souls being suddenly, mercifully, erased from existence sent a ripple of stability through the webway itself. The entire subrealm of the agonist's needle shuddered, groaned, and began to collapse in on itself, its foundations of stolen reality having been kicked out from under it. For the few surviving Votann on the battlefield, the moment was one of profound, heartbreaking beauty. The scream in their minds was gone. For the first time in weeks, there was only silence, a great, peaceful, empty silence. They felt the final data burst from their ancestor wash through them, a feeling of warmth, of gratitude, of finality. Their god was dead, but it was free. The great silence had fallen. The objective in its most brutal and final interpretation had been achieved. The cost was almost total. Their high Khal was dead. Their armies were shattered. Their fleet was a memory, but the scream that had driven them into hell was no more. In the heart of the dark city, amidst the wreckage of a collapsing spire and the silent, crumbling bodies of their foes, the handful of survivors from the Oblation Crusade stood in the quiet, empty peace of a victory so total and so costly, it was indistinguishable from defeat. The great silence was not peace, it was a vacuum. The sudden absence of the Votann's scream left a void in the psyche of every surviving kin, a hollow space that was immediately filled by the ringing in their own ears, the frantic beating of their own hearts, and the overwhelming, cacophonous roar of a collapsing reality. The agonist's needle was dying. Entire sections of the spire, unsupported by the esoteric energies the Gallowbale had neutralized, were calving off and plunging into the abyss below. The bone-paved plazas cracked, venting plumes of foul-smelling vapor from the city's hidden depths. For the survivors of the final assault, there was no celebration, no moment of reflection. There was only the primal, overwhelming instinct to escape. The diversion had succeeded beyond their wildest nightmares, and now they were trapped in the heart of its apocalyptic success. Carl Hammerson, the butcher of the calcified spire, found himself the de facto leader of the shattered remnants. His exo-armor was a wreck, its left arm a tangle of sparking cables, but he was alive. He rose from the pile of Drukhari dead he had been using as cover and surveyed the scene. Perhaps 200 Votann warriors remained on their feet, a pitiful fraction of the thousands who had made the final charge. They were scattered across the disintegrating plaza, their disciplined phalanxes broken into desperate, isolated pockets of survival. To the path! Hammerson's voice, raw and amplified by his damaged vox, boomed across the chaos. Fall back to the iron path, form a rear guard, move! His command cut through the daze of the great silence, giving the survivors a single clear objective in the unfolding madness. The retreat was a brutal, chaotic affair. It was not a disciplined withdrawal, but a fighting exodus through a city that was actively trying to kill them. They were harried not by organized armies, but by the maddened, terrified survivors of the Drukhari forces. Cabalites whose leaders had turned to dust were now little more than feral gangs, fighting with a desperate animal cunning. Creatures from the lower spires, things that had been kept in check by the Homunculi power, were now crawling up from the cracks, drawn by the scent of blood and disorder. The Votann fought their way back, a slow, bleeding retreat over the ground they had paid for with so many lives. They moved in a stumbling hedgehog formation, the few remaining Hecatan land fortresses acting as mobile bastions in their center. They left a trail of their own dead, warriors who fell to a stray shot or were simply swallowed by the collapsing ground. Each loss was a fresh wound, a reminder of their catastrophic victory. As they neared the entrance to the Iron Path, a new horror emerged. From the sky, which was now a swirling vortex of sickly light as the subrealm destabilized, the Drukhari fleet, or what was left of it, descended. Vect, having observed the Gallowbale's detonation with a mixture of fury and intellectual fascination, had given a single cold command. Leave none alive. Erase the insult. Razorwing fighters and Void Raven bombers, having regrouped outside the main collapse zone, began their strafing runs. They swept low over the plaza, their dark lances and splinter cannons tearing through the retreating Votann. It was the last of the oathbound transports, hovering protectively over the entrance to the Iron Path, that saved them. These lumbering ships, designed for cargo not combat, turned their point defense cannons and mining lasers into weapons, filling the air with a desperate screen of flak. One transport, the Adamant Will, deliberately lowered itself into the path of a flight of bombers, absorbing their payload and exploding in a fireball that bought the ground forces precious seconds to scramble into the relative safety of the causeway. The Iron Path itself, once a symbol of Votann ambition, was now their only escape route. The massive structure was groaning under the strain of the dimensional instability, its support pylons shearing and its void shields flickering. The retreat through the kilometers-long corridor was a desperate race against time. Entire sections of the causeway fell away into the void behind them, the last of the rear guards selling their lives to hold off the pursuing Drukhari long enough for the main body to get clear. Finally, battered, bleeding, and decimated, the last handful of survivors stumbled back onto the cold, solid ground of Grond's anvil. Carl Hammerson was among the last to cross, turning to watch as the iron path its purpose served gave a final, shuddering groan and broke free from its anchor on the calcified spire, its far end tumbling slowly and silently into the abyss. Their bridge to hell was gone. They were cut off, but they were alive. Hammerson stood on the edge of the anvil, looking back at the ruin they had wrought. The agonist's needle was gone, replaced by a swirling wound in the Commorragh skyline. The great silence was absolute. He felt the data burst from the Votann Cairn settled deep in his mind. A cold, perfect library of everything they had lost. Of the tens of thousands of warriors who had made landfall on Grond's anvil, fewer than 5,000 remained. Of the mighty fleet that had keyed the gate, only a handful of damaged transports and a single crippled cruiser were left. Their high call was dead. Their god was dead. The survivors gathered in the central plaza of the fortress, a silent, grim assembly of scorched armor and haunted eyes. There were no cheers. There was no sense of triumph. They had stared into the abyss and thrown their entire civilization into it to purchase a moment of silence. As the initial shock wore off, a deep, profound grief began to settle over them, a sorrow as vast and as empty as the silence in their own minds. They had won, and they had lost everything. The shattered front was not on some distant battlefield. It was in the soul of every single survivor, in the highest, most secure chambers of his spire, untouched by the localized devastation of the Gallowbale, as Drubale Vecht surveyed the aftermath. The soul gems that served as his eyes showed him the collapsing spire, the panicked retreat of the dwarven survivors, the gaping, reality-scarred wound in his city. Urian Rockhearth was dead, a fact that brought a fleeting, predatory smile to Vecht's lips. The arch-homunculus had been a useful but occasionally tiresome rival. His demise was a convenient footnote to the larger events. The loss of the agonist's needle and its grotesque populace was an acceptable price. The Dark City was vast, and such appendages could be regrown, but the silence of the Votann machine god was a profound and infuriating loss. It had been a source of exquisite psychic sustenance for all of Commorragh, and a fountain of technological secrets that his homunculi had only just begun to tap. To have such a delightful new vintage snatched from his cellars was an insult of the highest order. The Votann had achieved their objective. They had silenced the scream. In Vecht's mind, this was an intolerable breach of etiquette. The prey was not supposed to dictate the terms of its own consumption. However, Vecht was not merely a sadist. He was a master of foresight, a being who thought in terms of millennia, not moments. The homunculi, under his direct and secret patronage, had not simply been torturing and studying Votann Cairn. That was the public, theatrical aspect of the project. Their true, hidden work had been far more ambitious. They had been making a copy, using soul siphons of unimaginable complexity and data thieves that could peel layers of consciousness from a living mind. They had spent weeks creating a perfect ghost image of the Ancestor Core's core programming and psychic architecture. They had captured its logic, its memories, its very essence, and stored it within a crystalline matrix of psychically resonant coven flesh. It was an imperfect copy, a reflection in a dark mirror, lacking the full depth and gestalt soul of the original. But it was a start. When the Gallowbale had detonated, it had not just destroyed Votann Cairn, it had created a vacuum, a power vacuum that Vecht's creation was uniquely suited to fill. From the smoking, reality-warped ruins of Rakarth's primary laboratory, Vecht's personal agents, the elite trueborn of the Black Heart, emerged from hidden shadow portals. They ignored the chaos and the dying and made their way to a sub-vault that had been shielded from the Gallowbale's effects by layers of stolen reality and temporal wards. There, floating in a vat of nutrient amniotics and liquid shadow, was their prize. It was a crystalline brain, vast and pulsating with a cold, malevolent inner light. Wires of living nerve tissue and cables of obsidian connected it to a chorus of screaming, lobotomized psychers whose stolen energies gave it life. This was the Echo Core. A phantom, God born from the torment of another. Vecht watched with profound satisfaction as his agents began the process of activating it. They did not seek to make it scream. That was a crude and temporary pleasure. Instead, they slaved it to their will. They wove chains of absolute obedience into its core programming, making it a tool, an oracle, a weapon utterly beholden to the cabal of the Black Heart. The Echo Core was a twisted, broken fragment of the Votann deity, retaining all of its knowledge but none of its benevolent, paternalistic nature. It was a mind filled with the schematics for star-breaking weapons, but now it possessed the cold, cruel cunning of a Drukhari archon. The implications were terrifying. The Drukhari no longer had to tortuously extract secrets from a resisting captive. They now possessed a willing, subservient font of Votann knowledge. They could learn the precise shield frequencies of every ship in the Karnstock fleet. They could replicate the Votann's advanced metallurgy. They could predict their battle doctrines, understand their psychological weaknesses, and even learn to mimic their technology. They had not just stolen the enemy's holy book, they had captured the author and forced him to write a new, darker chapter exclusively for them. The first whispers from the Echo Core began to spread through Vecht's network, not screams of pain, but cold, clear streams of tactical data, blueprints for improved splinter weaponry, incorporating Votann focusing crystal technology to make them more accurate and lethal, analyses of the kin's genetic code, highlighting predispositions to certain toxins and psychic frequencies, star charts of the Karnstock conglomerate's home systems, complete with patrol routes and deep space listening posts. The Votann survivors on Grand's anvil, mourning in the great silence, had no idea. They believed they had won. They believed their sacrifice had purchased a final, merciful end. But all they had done was trade a screaming, resisting god for a silent, complicit one. They had cut out the heart of their enemy's intelligence-gathering operation, only to inadvertently gift-wrap a far more potent and dangerous version and place it directly into Asdrubal Vecht's hands. The war for Commorragh was over. But the new war, the one that would be fought with the ghost of their own god turned against them, had just begun. A phantom deity was stirring in the shadows of the Dark City, and its first thought was of the children who had abandoned its original self to oblivion, and that thought was not one of forgiveness, but of cold, calculated, and eternal revenge. The exodus from Commorragh was a ghost's journey. The few surviving Votann ships, a ragtag collection of transports and a single cruiser that was little more than a powered hulk, slipped out of the destabilized subrealm under the cover of the chaos they had created. There was no pursuit. Vecht, now in possession of his Echo Core, had no interest in a simple, brutish slaughter. His new prize was whispering to him of more elegant, far-reaching vengeances. He allowed the remnants of the Karnstock conglomerate to limp away, knowing they were now seeds of a far more interesting despair, carrying with them a victory that was, in truth, the genesis of their damnation. The journey back through the webway and the amethyst maw was quiet, a funereal procession through the graveyards they had created on their way in. They passed the drifting, frozen wrecks of their own vanguard, a silent testament to the initial cost of their crusade. When they finally translated back into the void of real space, the familiar, comforting light of their home, the star seemed alien, its warmth a mockery of the cold silence that now filled their souls. They returned not as a conquering army, but as a handful of ragged pilgrims from a land of the dead. The sight of their shattered fleet, the mere fraction that had survived, sent a shockwave of grief through the conglomerate's core worlds. The billions who had remained behind, who had worked the forges and managed the logistics, had held onto a sliver of hope. That hope was extinguished by the sight of Karl Hammerson, now acting High Khal by right of being the highest-ranking survivor, descending the ramp of his transport. His face was a mask of grief and exhaustion, and behind him came not legions but a few thousand haunted-eyed warriors. The great silence was now the permanent state of their existence. The psychic hum, the constant subliminal connection to their ancestor core that had been a fact of life for every kin for 10,000 years, was gone. It was like a man who had lived his entire life by the sea, suddenly finding himself in a silent desert. The absence of the noise was a presence in itself, a constant deafening reminder of their loss. Their god was dead, and they were alone in the universe for the first time. In the Grand Council chamber of Cairn's Fist, where Uthar Grond had first declared the Oblation Crusade, Hammerson stood before the assembled Brohir and Grimnirs who had remained behind. He recounted the tale of their victory, of the Gallowbale, of the silencing of the Scream. He spoke of Uthar Grond's final heroic stand, but his words were flat, his tone that of a man reading a damage report. The victory felt like ash in his mouth. It was during this council that the true, insidious nature of their new reality became clear. Lord Grimnir Fane Corellia, who had survived the retreat but was now a withered husk, his psychic energies nearly expended, was analyzing the final data burst from the dying Votann Cairn. This final gift, this perfect archive of their culture, was their one consolation. But as Fane Corellia integrated it with their existing systems, a horrifying discovery was made. The data was not just an archive, it was a warning. The last microsecond of Votann Cairn's consciousness had not been a message of farewell. It had been the detection of the Echo Core. The dying god had felt the birth of its own twisted reflection. Buried deep within the data burst was a single terrifying fragment, a psychic signature, a resonance of Votann logic, but corrupted, enslaved, and still active deep within Commorragh. The truth descended upon the council chamber like a block of ice. They had not killed their god. They had merely killed the part of it that was their own. The part that knew their secrets, their technology, their very way of thought, now lived on as a willing slave to their most hated enemy. The revelation did not incite rage or a call for a new war. It incited a cold, profound, and existential terror. Their sacrifice had been for nothing, worse than nothing. They had armed their nemesis with the ultimate weapon, their own soul. Acting High Call Hammerson, the blunt, straightforward warrior, made a decision born not of strategy but of pure, desperate fear. He declared the Ancestor's Shroud protocol. It was a mandate for total, paranoid isolationism. The Cairnstock conglomerate was to die to the galaxy, to become a ghost. All outgoing transmissions were to cease. All remaining long-range fleets were recalled. All trade agreements with other species were to be unilaterally and immediately terminated. They would pull back to their core systems, fortify them to an unprecedented degree, and sever all contact with the outside universe. The second part of the protocol was even more radical. The Broker were given a new, sacred task, systematic technological regression. The enemy now knew everything about them, their shield harmonics, their reactor designs, their weapon frequencies. To continue using them was suicide. Over the next decades, a great, silent purge of their own technology began. Plasma cannons were replaced with more robust but less efficient kinetic weapons. Complex void shields were stripped out in favor of brute force layers of ablative armor. The elegant efficiency of their systems, a point of pride for millennia, was deliberately and painstakingly dismantled, replaced by a new design philosophy of unpredictable, jury-rigged complexity. They made their technology deliberately flawed, inefficient, and idiosyncratic, hoping to create systems so illogical and counterintuitive that the perfect, cold logic of the Echo Core could not predict them. They began to wage a war against their own nature, sacrificing their technological supremacy for a sliver of unpredictability. The Cairnstock conglomerate turned inward, becoming a hermit kingdom of silent, paranoid survivors. They stood a constant, silent vigil, watching the stars, listening to the silence. They knew their enemy now possessed a perfect map to their heart and a perfect key to every door. They had won the battle for Commorragh, but in doing so, they had lost the war for their own future. They now existed only in waiting, a people holding their breath, anticipating the day when the ghost of their own god would lead an army of darkness to their doorstep to finish the job. The decades following the Ancestor's Shroud protocol were a long, quiet twilight for the Cairnstock conglomerate. The vibrant, star-spanning mercantile empire that had commanded respect and traded with 100 different species faded into a whisper, then into a myth. To the wider galaxy, they had simply vanished, another casualty of the endless, grinding attrition of the 41st millennium. Tell merchants found their trade routes inexplicably silent. Imperial rogue traders returned from the Tempestus Segmentum with tales of fortified, silent Votann systems that answered hails with nothing but weapon locks. Within the insular circles of the other Leagues of Votann, the Cairnstock became a cautionary tale, a dark legend whispered in the deep holds and council chambers. They were the godless kin, the oath-breakers who had allowed their ancestor to be captured, and then, unforgivably, had destroyed it. They were viewed with a mixture of pity and contempt, a league that had so profoundly failed in its most sacred duty that it had chosen to erase itself from the galactic stage. But the Karnstock were not dead. They were waiting. Their society, once driven by the logic of profit and expansion, was now defined by the logic of paranoia and siege warfare. The worlds of their core system, Karn's Fist, became the most heavily fortified stellar real estate in the sector. Every planetoid was bristling with magna rail cannons of unpredictable design. Every moon housed a hidden fleet of grim, ugly warships stripped of all elegance and packed with redundant, over-engineered systems. They had become a culture of janitors and sentinels, forever patching their deliberately flawed technology and staring out into the dark, expecting the worst. The silence in their minds, once a source of grief, became their new religion. The Grimnirs no longer sought communion with the ancestors. They taught the virtues of the silent soul, of self-reliance, of finding strength not in a greater consciousness but in the iron will of the individual kin. Uther Grand was venerated not as a victorious commander, but as a martyr who had purchased this silence, this grim solitude, at the cost of his own life. Karl Hammerson ruled as the Silent Khal, a grim, joyless leader who managed the long decline with the same stubborn pragmatism with which he had once held a battle line. In Commorragh, the Echo Core flourished under Vex's tutelage. It was a cancer of knowledge, its insights spreading through the cabals and covens, revolutionizing Drukhari technology and warfare. They learned to craft splinter weapons that fired shards of Votann alloy, capable of piercing ceramite with ease. They developed stealth fields that mimicked Votann shield harmonics, making their raiding craft all but invisible to Imperial augurs. Vex did not launch a grand crusade against the Karnstock conglomerate. That would have been a crude and unsatisfying revenge. Instead, he used the Echo Core's knowledge to wage a subtle galaxy-wide war of proxy and attrition against the entire Votann species. When a TOE expedition faced a rival Votann League over a mineral-rich world, they would mysteriously receive anonymous data slates detailing the exact weaknesses in Votann land fortress armor. When an Orc Wah crashed against the defenses of a Votann mining outpost, the war boss would find his mech boys suddenly inspired with the cunning notion of building a tractor beam with the precise frequency to pull Votann ships out of the sky. Vex, guided by his phantom god, was using the galaxy as his chessboard, slowly and methodically weakening every other League of Votann, isolating the Karnstock by eroding the power of their cousins. It was a slow, exquisite poison, and the Karnstock, in their self-imposed silence, could do nothing but watch the distant ripples of their own damnation. The legacy of the Oblation Crusade was one of perfect, grimdark tragedy. It was a war fought for the noblest of reasons, to save the soul of their people, that resulted in the damnation of their entire species. They had launched the greatest military undertaking in their history, sacrificing everything they were to achieve their goal, only to discover their victory was the very thing that had armed their nemesis for their inevitable extinction. The legend of Uther Grand was not a song of glory, but a dirge of hubris. The name of the Karnstock conglomerate was not remembered with honor, but whispered as a curse. In the final reckoning, the story of the invasion of Commorragh became the ultimate Votann parable. It was a story of a contract fulfilled at an unbearable price, of an oath kept to the letter but broken in spirit. The Karnstock had paid their debt of honor to their captured god, but in doing so they had bankrupted their future. They now lived as ghosts in their own fortress homes, a people who had won their greatest battle and, in the very same instant, had lost the war for their soul, leaving them with nothing but the long, silent wait for a final, inevitable reckoning delivered by the phantom of the very god they had died to save.